The moment Caleb Hurst heard her voice drifting through the cottonwood trees, every muscle in his body simply stopped working, and he sank down into the tall grass along the creek bank without a single thought of standing back up. He had ridden hard all morning through the Texas hill country, pushing his sorrel mare, Duchess, across limestone flats and through cedar breaks under a June sky that hung white with heat. It was 1878, and Caleb was 26 years old, a working cowboy who had spent the better part of a decade doing exactly what working cowboys did: riding, roping, branding, sleeping under stars on bedrolls that smelled of horse sweat and dust, eating beans from a tin and calling it plenty. He was not a complicated man, or so he believed. He had never sat down in the grass and refused to move for anything short of an arrow or a bullet. But the voice that came through those trees was something he had no name for. It was clear and low and sweet, the way a creek sounds when it moves over smooth stones in the late afternoon, not rushing, not trickling, just flowing with a kind of unhurried confidence. She was singing something he almost recognized, a hymn maybe, though she had bent the melody into something more personal, something that sounded less like church and more like a woman telling the truth to an empty sky. The words reached him in fragments through the leaves. Something about home, and something about leaving, and something about a river that never dried up no matter how bad the summer got. Duchess swung her head around and looked at Caleb with one large brown eye, clearly waiting to know what the plan was. Caleb had no plan. He looped the reins around his wrist, sat down in the grass and listened. He told himself later that he had stopped because he was tired. He had ridden 12 miles from the Harker Ranch that morning carrying a letter from the foreman to a land agent in Fredericksburg, and the heat had been merciless. He told himself the shade along the creek bank was too good to pass up, that any reasonable man would have stopped. He almost believed it. The singing went on for a while, unhurried and private, the voice moving through the melody the way a bird moves through a familiar tree without looking at its feet. Then it stopped. There was the sound of water being poured, a soft splash, and then silence. Caleb stayed where he was. He pulled his hat down over his face and stared up at the weave of the straw brim and told himself firmly that he was going to get up in a moment. He did not get up. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. He tilted his hat back and turned his head. And there she was standing at the edge of the tree line, holding a wooden bucket that dripped clean creek water onto the dry ground at her feet. She was looking at him with an expression that mixed equal parts surprise and irritation in a way that suggested she was more accustomed to the irritation side of that combination. She was about 22, he judged. Dark hair pulled back and pinned, loose strands coming undone around her face from the heat. Brown eyes, deep-set and direct. She wore a practical blue calico dress that had seen better days but was clean, and her boots were the kind a woman bought for working in, not for looking at. "You are lying in my grass," she said. Caleb sat up straight. "Ma'am, I apologize. I did not know this was your grass." "It is adjacent to my property," she said, "which makes it close enough." He got to his feet and pulled his hat off. "Caleb Hurst, ma'am. I ride for the Harker outfit out past the ridge. I was passing through and stopped to rest in the shade." She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are still deciding about. "Clara Voss," she said finally. "My father owns the farm on the other side of those trees." "It is good country out here," Caleb said, because he had to say something, and that was the most honest thing he could think of. "It is dry country," she said. "The well is low, and I have to carry water from the creek." He looked at the bucket. He looked at her. He thought about the fact that he was supposed to be in Fredericksburg before sundown. "I could carry that for you," he said, "if you have more trips to make." She narrowed her eyes slightly, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to measure offers before accepting them. "Why would you do that?" "Because the bucket looks heavy and the walk looks long," he said, "and I have a horse." She almost smiled. He could see it happen at the corner of her mouth, that small involuntary movement that happens before a person's face remembers to be cautious. "I have 4 more trips to make," she said. "Then let me help," he said. She considered him for another moment, then nodded once and turned back toward the creek. His name was Caleb Hurst, but he had been called Cal since boyhood, the way most men in this country were whittled down to something shorter and easier to shout across a pasture. He had been born in Tennessee and come west at 17 with his older brother Thomas, who had since married a woman in San Antonio and settled into the business of selling dry goods, leaving Cal to the open range and the seasonal rhythms of cattle work. He was not unhappy with his life. He had simply never stopped long enough to consider whether he might want something else. He carried water with Clara Voss 4 times that afternoon, leading Duchess along the worn path between the creek and the farm, and on each trip back from the creek Clara told him one small thing about her life, and he told her one small thing about his. And by the time the water barrel beside the barn was full, they had assembled between them the rough outline of 2 people. Her father, Wilhelm Voss, had come from Germany in 1861 as a young man and settled in the Texas Hill Country, which was already home to a significant community of German immigrants who had built towns and farms and churches in the cedar-covered limestone hills between San Antonio and the Colorado River. He had married a woman named Anna who had died of fever 3 years ago, leaving him with Clara, who was his only child still at home. An older son had gone to work on the railroad and sent letters once a month that arrived bent and water-stained. Clara had stayed. She had stayed because she was the kind of person who stayed, and because her father's hands shook in the mornings now in a way that made the smaller tasks difficult, and because the farm was the only home she had ever known, and because leaving had never seemed like the braver choice to her, only the easier one. Caleb listened to all of this while carrying water and thought that she was one of the most honest people he had ever met, in the way that people who have dealt with real things tend to become honest without quite intending to. On the last trip back from the creek, Clara asked him what he had been doing lying in the grass before she found him. "Resting," he said. "You did not look like you were resting," she said. "You looked like you had been there for a while." He was quiet for a moment, watching Duchess pick her way along the path. "I heard you singing," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped walking. They stood in the middle of the path with the full bucket between them and the afternoon heat pressing down on everything. "I was not singing for an audience," she said. "I know that," he said. "That is why it was worth listening to." She looked at him for a long moment and then picked up the bucket again and walked toward the barn without saying anything else. But when they reached the barrel and she poured the last of the water in, she turned to him and said, "You can tell my father you helped. He will want to thank you properly, and he will insist on feeding you supper." Caleb looked at the western sky, where the light was turning the color of old brass, and thought about Fredericksburg and the letter in his saddlebag, and the agent who was probably already locking up his office. "I would like that," he said. Wilhelm Voss was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who had gone thin in the way that serious illness goes thin, but whose voice still carried the deep, confident timbre of a man who had spent decades giving instructions outdoors. He sat at the head of the supper table with his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup and listened to Caleb with the kind of attentiveness that said he was genuinely interested in what other people had to say, which Caleb found rare and worth respecting. They ate pan bread and salt pork and early summer beans, and Wilhelm asked Caleb questions about the Harker Ranch and the cattle market and the state of the roads between the hill country and San Antonio, and Caleb answered them honestly. Clara served and ate, and occasionally added something brief and precise that redirected the conversation when it drifted toward abstraction. After supper, Wilhelm walked Caleb to where Duchess was tied and shook his hand with both of his and told him that he was welcome at this table any time he chose to ride this way. His eyes, Caleb noticed, were the same dark brown as Clara's and carried the same quality of careful attention. Caleb rode back to the Harker Ranch in the dark, arriving well past midnight. The foreman, a leathery man named Gus Pemberton, was sitting on the bunkhouse steps smoking a pipe and said only, "Fredericksburg." in a tone that managed to convey everything from mild inquiry to resigned disapproval. "I will go in the morning," Caleb said. Gus Pemberton smoked his pipe and said nothing further, which was one of the things Caleb appreciated about him. He went to Fredericksburg the next morning and delivered the letter and came back by way of the creek path through the cottonwood trees, telling himself that it was not significantly out of his way, which was not entirely true. He did not hear anyone singing. But he stopped at the farm anyway and asked whether the water barrel needed filling again. And Clara looked at him from the doorway of the farmhouse with those measuring eyes and said that it did not, but that her father's fence posts on the north side of the property had been rotting for 2 seasons, and she had not had time to dig them out and reset them, and that if he was offering help in a general sense she would not refuse it. Caleb spent the afternoon digging post holes in the rocky limestone soil, which was some of the hardest physical work he had done in recent memory, and Clara brought him water twice and stood nearby on both occasions longer than was strictly necessary for the purpose of delivering water. On the third visit to the Voss farm, which happened a week later and which Caleb arranged by volunteering to carry a message from Gus Pemberton to a neighboring rancher whose property happened to border the road that passed the Voss place, Clara was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 oak trees, and she did not stop working when he rode up, only turned her head and said, "The fence posts held." "Good limestone sets hard," he said. "You know about that." "I know a little about most things," he said. "I have had a long time to pick things up." She pulled a shirt from the basket and shook it out with a sharp, efficient snap of her wrists. "What do you know about apple trees?" she said. "Some," he said. "What is wrong with yours?" There was an apple tree on the south side of the house that had come from Germany as a cutting, and had been growing in this foreign soil for 15 years, and it had never produced fruit as abundantly as it should have. Clara had opinions about why this was the case, and Caleb had a different set of opinions, and they argued about it for 20 minutes in a way that was so thoroughly comfortable and natural that neither of them realized, until it was over, that they had been arguing at all. And by the end of it, they had arrived at a shared plan that involved pruning and soil amendment and specific attention to drainage, and Clara seemed slightly pleased and slightly annoyed, which Caleb was already learning was her preferred emotional state. He came back the following week on his own time, with no message to deliver and no errand that justified the ride. He brought a small sack of wood ash from the Harker bunkhouse fire pit, which was good for soil, and he worked on the apple tree for an hour while Clara sat on the porch and read from a book written in German, occasionally looking up and watching him without bothering to pretend she was not watching him. When he came up to the porch and washed his hands in the basin she had set out, she said, without looking up from her book, "My father has been asking about you." "Asking what?" "Whether you are a man of good character," she said, "whether your intentions are honest." Caleb dried his hands on the towel. "What did you tell him?" She looked up then, and the afternoon light was full on her face and her eyes were very direct. "I told him that I did not know yet," she said, "but that I was finding out." He sat down on the step below the porch and looked out at the yard and said, "That seems fair." "I think so," she said, and went back to her book. He sat there for another hour, and they did not talk very much, but the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that means 2 people are comfortable in the same space. And when he finally got up to ride back to the ranch, Clara set her book down in her lap and said, "Same time next week." "Yes," he said. The summer moved through its long heat in that particular way that Texas summers have, where the days seem to last longer than days have any right to, and the nights bring a relief that is just barely enough to make the next day bearable. Caleb came to the Voss farm every week, sometimes twice a week when he could manage it, and each time he came he found more to do and more to talk about and more reasons to stay longer than he had planned. He helped Wilhelm with the heavier work that the older man's shaking hands made difficult. He split wood and mended tack and rebuilt a section of the barn roof where a spring storm had peeled back the shingles. Wilhelm watched him work with the satisfied expression of a man who was watching a plan come together, and occasionally offered opinions on the proper way to do things that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and always delivered with complete confidence. Clara cooked. She was a very good cook, in the German farmhouse tradition that took simple ingredients and applied to them a methodical patience that transformed them into something worth sitting down for. She made bread that had a crust that cracked properly when you broke it, and a crumb that was dense and slightly sour and perfect. She made thick soups with whatever the garden was producing, and pastries on Sundays that were an exercise in restrained perfection. Caleb ate at the Voss table more and more often as the summer went on, and he noticed that the conversations at that table were different from any conversations he had in his daily life. At the ranch, men talked about cattle and weather and the price of things, and occasionally about women in a way that was more bravado than substance. At the Voss table, they talked about all of that too, but they also talked about ideas, about what was happening in the country, about what life was supposed to amount to. And Clara held opinions on every subject and stated them without apology and argued them with precision when challenged. She had read more than anyone Caleb knew. Her father had believed in education and had seen to it that she had books even in the hill country in both German and English, and she had made use of every one of them. She knew about farming and about history, and about the wider world that existed beyond the cedar breaks and limestone hills, and she talked about that wider world with the particular mix of longing and rootedness that belongs to people who love where they are but cannot help knowing that other places exist. Caleb found himself reading when he could, borrowing books from the small collection the ranch kept for the rare literate Cowboy, so that he would have things to bring to the conversations at the Voss table. He started with a history of Texas that one of the other hands had, and then moved on to a battered copy of a natural history book that he found at the general store in Fredericksburg. And he talked about what he read with Clara in the direct, enthusiastic way of a person who is discovering that learning is interesting when it is shared with the right person. It was on a Tuesday in late August, when the heat was at its absolute worst and the air smelled of dry grass and hot stone, that Caleb arrived at the farm to find Clara sitting on the porch alone with a piece of paper in her hands and an expression on her face that he had not seen before, a kind of tightly controlled unhappiness that was doing its best to look like composure. He tied Duchess to the post and came up to the porch. "What is that?" he said. She handed it to him. It was a letter from a man named Gerald Stout, written in the formal and slightly aggressive style of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the force of persistence. Gerald Stout was a land buyer from Austin who had been purchasing smaller farms in the hill country for 2 years, assembling them into larger tracts that he then sold on to cattle operations from the north. He was offering Wilhelm Voss a price for the farm that was honest enough to be worth considering and insufficient enough to be an insult, and the letter made clear that he expected an answer within 30 days. Caleb read it twice. "Is your father thinking about accepting?" "My father is trying not to think about it at all," Clara said, "which means he is thinking about it constantly. What do you want to do?" She looked out at the yard with those measuring eyes, at the apple tree on the south side of the house that was already showing better growth since the pruning, at the vegetable garden along the fence line, at the barn that Caleb had half re-roofed and that now stood solid against the sky. "I want to stay," she said, "but wanting does not pay taxes." Caleb handed the letter back. He sat down on the step below the porch and was quiet for a moment. "How much are the back taxes?" she told him. It was not an enormous amount by some measures, but it was enormous relative to what a farm this size could produce in the hill country, where the soil was thin over limestone and the rains were unreliable, and the nearest market was a full day's ride. "I have some saved," Caleb said carefully. She looked at him with an expression so sharp it almost had edges. "Do not say what I think you are about to say," she said. "I was going to say that I have some saved and that I know men who might have more, and that there might be ways to negotiate the tax situation before it reaches the point where selling is the only option, he said. That is what I was going to say. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then some of the sharpness went out of her expression, not all of it, but enough. "All right," she said. "That is acceptable." What followed was a practical conversation about money and land and legal options that lasted an hour, and was entirely unglamorous, and also one of the most intimate conversations Caleb had ever had with another person, because it required honesty about the specific details of each of their circumstances. And that kind of specific honesty creates a closeness that softer conversations rarely achieve. By the end of it, they had a rough plan. Caleb would go to Fredericksburg and speak with the county tax assessor, a man named Hoffman whom Caleb had met through the Harker Ranch business, and determine exactly what was owed and what arrangements might be possible. Clara would write to her brother on the railroad and ask, plainly and without drama, whether he could contribute anything. They would also speak to the German community, because the German communities in the Hill Country had traditions of mutual support that went back to the earliest days of settlement, and that had helped many families through difficult seasons. Wilhelm came out of the house in the middle of this conversation, heard enough to understand what was happening, and sat down in the chair beside Clara without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said in his accented English, "You are a good man, Caleb Hurst." "I am trying to be useful," Caleb said. "That is the same thing," Wilhelm said. The trip to Fredericksburg took Caleb 2 days, because he went not only to the tax assessor, but also to 2 men he knew who had business dealings in the Hill Country, and who might have either advice or contacts worth having. One of them, a rancher named Dietrich who ran a cattle operation east of town, turned out to have been a neighbor of the Voss family in the early days and had not known of their difficulty, and was immediately and practically concerned in a way that involved offers of credit and introductions to people who could help. Caleb came back from Fredericksburg with information and a tentative agreement from Dietrich for a short-term loan at reasonable terms, and with the knowledge that the tax situation was more manageable than the letter from Gerald Stout had implied, because men like Gerald Stout preferred to create a sense of urgency that was not entirely accurate. When he told Clara all of this on the porch while Wilhelm sat inside and rested, she listened carefully and then said, "You did not have to do all of that." "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and the space between them was full of everything that had been accumulating since that first afternoon when he heard her singing through the trees and sat down in the grass and forgot entirely that he was supposed to be somewhere else. "Because I would like very much for you to be able to stay in this place," he said, "and because I would like very much to keep coming here." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence that happens when something true has been said, and the person who heard it is taking the time to let it settle properly. "I would like you to keep coming here too," Clara said finally, and her voice was even and direct as always, but her hands, which had been still on her lap, moved slightly, as though she had been about to reach for something and then thought better of it. Caleb stayed for supper and rode home in the dark again, and this time when Gus Pemberton looked up from the bunkhouse steps, he did not even ask. September came, and with it the first break in the heat, a morning when you could step outside before sunrise and feel something in the air that was not quite cool, but was no longer hostile. The apple tree on the south side of the Voss farmhouse produced more fruit that fall than it had in 3 years, and Clara picked it carefully, and stored what she could, and made the rest into preserves that she put up in glass jars lined on the shelf in the larder, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has put a year's worth of work into something, and watched it pay off. Caleb helped with the harvest, which at this scale meant helping dig potatoes and pull the last of the summer vegetables and cut and stack the dry cornstalks for the animals. It was companionable work. the kind that does not require much conversation, but is better for having company. And they worked beside each other through the golden September days, and talked sometimes, and were quiet sometimes, and ate lunch sitting in the shade of the oak trees with Wilhelm, who told stories about Germany in the easy, nostalgic way of old men for whom the past has become pleasant now that it cannot hurt them anymore. On the last day of September, which was a Sunday, Clara asked Caleb whether he would walk with her in the evening, and he said yes, and they walked along the creek path through the cottonwood trees as the light went amber, and the water made its low constant sound over the stones. They walked for a while without talking. The evening was the best kind of Texas evening, where the sky goes through colors you cannot quite name, and the air smells like cedar and something cooler coming down from the north. "I used to walk here in the evenings with my mother," Clara said. "She liked this time of day." "What was she like?" Caleb asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. "She was practical," she said. "Very direct. She did not waste words on things that did not need saying." "I can see where you get that from," he said. She looked at him sideways with that almost smile. "She was also, when the situation called for it, quite sentimental," she said. "She just did not advertise it." "I can see where you get that from too," he said. They had stopped walking without quite noticing it, there beside the creek in the cottonwood shade, and the water moved past them, and the light was doing extraordinary things to everything it touched. Clara turned to look at him with those direct eyes, and he thought that he had never in his life met anyone who looked at people the way she did, as though she was actually seeing them rather than just looking at them. "Caleb," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you should know something," she said. "I am not a simple person. I have opinions about most things, and I am not particularly inclined to change them without very good reason. I am attached to this place and to my father, and I am not willing to pretend that those attachments are things I could easily set aside. I am telling you this now rather than later because I believe in being clear before things become complicated." He looked at her for a long moment. The cottonwood leaves moved in the small breeze off the water. "Clara," he said, "I heard you singing through those trees the first day I came here, and I sat down in the grass and did not move. I think that tells you something about where I stand." The almost smile became a real smile then, brief and brilliant and private, the kind of smile you only see when a person is not trying to smile at all, and it changed her whole face in a way that he thought he would probably spend a very long time thinking about. She reached out and took his hand once quickly, and then let it go and turned back toward the farm. "Come on," she said. "Father will have the coffee on." He walked beside her back through the trees in the evening light and thought that he was, in some essential way, a changed man, and that the change had happened weeks ago when he first sat down in that grass and been too arrested by a voice to remember what he was supposed to be doing. October arrived with a letter from Clara's brother, whose name was Heinrich, but who went by Henry now in the railroad world. He sent a bank draft that was modest but meaningful, and a letter that was stiff with the particular guilt of a person who knows he has left more than his share of things to someone else. Clara read the letter, put the bank draft in the tin box where the family kept important documents, and wrote her brother back a reply that was warm but also honest, because she had not learned to waste words even in letters. With the Dietrich loan and Henry's contribution, and a small amount that Caleb quietly added from his own savings, which he did not tell Clara about directly, but which Wilhelm knew about and accepted with a handshake and a dignity that made Caleb respect him even more, the tax situation was resolved before Gerald Stout's 30-day deadline expired. When Clara wrote to Mr. Stout to inform him that the farm was not for sale, she kept the letter to 2 sentences, which Caleb thought was probably more than Stout deserved. November brought the cold down from the north in earnest, the kind of cold that the hill country gets in waves, clear and sharp, and the farm settled into its winter rhythms. Caleb continued to come on his days off, and sometimes in the evenings after the ranch work was done, He rode the extra miles to sit by the fire in the Voss farmhouse and drink coffee and talk. It was on one of these evenings, a Thursday in late November with rain coming in sideways against the windows and the fire doing its best work, that Wilhelm looked up from his chair and said without preamble, "When are you going to ask my daughter to marry you?" Clara, who was at the table mending a shirt, did not look up but went very still in a way that suggested she was listening with her entire body. Caleb looked at Wilhelm, who looked back with complete serenity. "Sir," Caleb said. "She is 22, Wilhelm said conversationally. "I am not young. The farm needs a man's strength and I do not always have it to give. And you have been coming here for 5 months with a look on your face that I last saw on my own face when I was courting my Anna." "Father," Clara said, in a tone that carried both warning and something that was helplessly close to affection. "I am not wrong," Wilhelm said. Caleb set down his coffee cup. He looked at Clara, who was looking at her mending with an expression of intense concentration that had nothing to do with the shirt. "Miss Voss," he said. She looked up. "Clara," he said, "I would like to ask you something with your father's permission." "You have it," Wilhelm said immediately, in the same conversational tone. "I would like to ask whether you would do me the very significant honor of marrying me," Caleb said. "I recognize that this is not the most elegant proposal in the history of proposals, given that it is happening in your father's kitchen on a rainy Thursday because your father apparently has no patience for a more considered approach, but the sentiment behind it is entirely genuine." Wilhelm made a sound of satisfaction and reached for his coffee. Clara looked at Caleb for a long moment, and he could see her thinking, could see her measuring the question against everything she had been learning about him for the past 5 months, against what she knew about herself and what she needed and what she could not compromise. He waited. He had learned to wait with her, had learned that the waiting was where she did her most important work. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Wilhelm set down his coffee cup and looked at the ceiling with an expression that suggested he was addressing someone up there. "Anna," he said softly in German, "you see, I managed." Caleb crossed the room to where Clara was sitting, and she stood up from her chair, and they were very close together for a moment in the firelight, and she put her hand against his chest the way you touch something you are still getting used to owning, and he covered her hand with his. "I should have asked more formally," he said. "I am sorry for that." "I do not need formality," she said. "I told you I am not a simple person. A simple person might need formality. I need truth, and you gave me that." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, old-fashioned and deliberate, and she watched him do it with that directness that never quite left her even in moments that would have made another woman look away. "Then we are agreed," he said. "We are agreed," she said. They were married in December, in the small German Lutheran church in the nearest town, which was a ride of 6 miles on a morning that was cold and clear and brilliant, the sky the color of pale blue porcelain, and the limestone hills showing white where the frost had not yet melted off the north faces. The congregation was small but warm, the German hill country community turning out in the way that communities do when they have known a family for a long time and feel that the occasion is worth their Sunday best. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been made in Germany and brought across an ocean and a continent in a trunk that had survived remarkable adversity, and which fit her with only minor adjustments. It was ivory silk, simply cut, without the elaborate decorations that were fashionable in the cities, and it suited her completely. Caleb wore his best suit, which was not very remarkable, and his good boots, which were. His brother Thomas came up from San Antonio with his wife, and made a point of shaking Caleb's hand with both of his and saying, "You look like a man who knows what he has found," which was the truest thing Thomas had said in years. Gus Pemberton came from the ranch and sat in the back of the church with his hat in his lap and his pipe in his breast pocket, and the expression of a man who is moved by something but is not willing to discuss it. The ceremony was conducted partly in German and partly in English, because the pastor accommodated both languages for a community that was still living between worlds. Wilhelm walked Clara down the aisle with a steadiness that he had been saving for this, his big hands no longer shaking, or at least not visibly, and he gave her hand to Caleb with the unhurried care of a man passing on something precious and fragile and strong all at once. When Clara said her vows, she said them looking directly at Caleb with those dark eyes, the way she did everything without looking away, and her voice was clear and steady, that same voice he had heard through the trees, and it went through him exactly the same way it had the first time. He said his own vows back to her, and meant every word with a specificity he had not known he was capable of. And when the pastor pronounced them married, and he kissed his wife in front of the small congregation, Clara put her hand on his face the way she had put it against his chest the night they got engaged, with that quality of touching something you are getting used to belonging to. The reception was at the Voss farm, where the German community had installed a celebration's worth of food and music that expanded the small farmhouse in the way that good people expand a space by filling it. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought an accordion, and the music that came out of that combination was not particularly refined, but it was joyful in the fundamental, bone-deep way that dance music is when the people playing it are genuinely happy. Caleb danced with his wife in the cleared space of the main room, and she danced with the ease of someone who had been dancing since childhood to this same music in this same community, and she guided him through the parts he did not know with the matter-of-fact efficiency with which she did everything, and he thought that he had never danced with this much pleasure in his life, though he had never been a man who placed much value on dancing. Wilhelm danced once, with Clara, a brief and careful waltz that made everyone in the room go quiet and watch, and Clara held her father's arm with both hands, and they moved together through the music with the particular grace of two people who have been through hard things together and come out the other side. And more than one person in that room found something in their eye that needed attending to. The next morning, Caleb moved his few things from the ranch bunkhouse to the Voss farm, which was now his home too. Gus Pemberton helped him carry his saddlebags out to where Duchess was tied and shook his hand, and said that he was sorry to lose a good hand, and that the offer of work stood whenever Caleb wanted it. Caleb had already been in conversation with a neighboring ranch about occasional seasonal work that would let him stay close to home, and that arrangement was agreed to by early January. He was not leaving cattle work entirely, because cattle work was what he knew and what he was good at, and the farm needed income beyond what it produced, but he was changing the terms of it, trading the constant movement of the open range for something more fixed and more his. He settled into the life of the farm with the same direct practical engagement that Clara brought to everything, learning what he did not know and applying what he did, and the two of them moved through the work of each day with a growing efficiency that was also a growing intimacy, because there is nothing that reveals two people to each other quite like working together in close quarters toward common ends. January and February were cold and gray and close, the kind of winter that turns a farm into a small world with its own complete interior logic. They read in the evenings, both of them, sometimes the same book and sometimes different ones, and they talked about what they read and argued pleasantly, and sometimes not so pleasantly, and always came to something more interesting than either of them had started with. Clara started teaching Caleb German. She did this with the patience of a naturally good teacher who is also amused by how much she is enjoying the process, and Caleb proved a better student than he expected, picking up the shape of the language more readily than either of them had anticipated, which Clara attributed to his having spent years listening carefully to the world around him, and which Caleb attributed to having a good teacher. Wilhelm watched all of this from his chair by the fire with a deep, private satisfaction. His health was not improving, and there were mornings when the shaking in his hands spread to his arms, and the tiredness in his face was visible from across the room, but he was content in a way that had nothing to do with health, the contentment of a man who has arranged things as well as they can be arranged, and now can rest in the arrangement. In March, Clara told Caleb on a quiet morning while they were drinking coffee before the day properly started that she was going to have a baby. She said it in the direct, even way that she said most things, looking at him across the table, and he looked back at her for a long moment with an expression on his face that she had not seen before, something open and unguarded and slightly overwhelmed. "When?" he said. "September," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat there in the early morning light with the coffee cooling between them and the knowledge of this new thing settling around them like something they had been moving toward all along without quite knowing it. "Are you frightened?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. "A little," she said, "but I have been frightened before. It does not stop anything from happening." "No," he said, "it does not." He told Wilhelm after breakfast, and the old man put his hands on the table and looked out the window at the yard for a moment and then looked back at Caleb with eyes that were bright and wet in a way that he made no effort to conceal. "Good," he said, "good." Spring came with its particular extravagance, the hills going green almost overnight after the winter rains, the creek running clear and full, the apple tree on the south side of the house breaking into bloom earlier and more profusely than any of them had hoped. Clara stood under it one morning and looked up at the white flowers against the sky with her hands on her hips and said, "I told you the drainage was the problem." "You were right," Caleb said from behind her. "I usually am," she said, and turned and walked back toward the house with that straight-backed walk of hers, and he watched her go with the particular kind of attention that he knew was going to be a permanent feature of his life, and was entirely fine with that. Summer came again, the second one since he had ridden through the cottonwood trees and heard her singing, and the farm moved through its rhythms with the two of them at the center of it, and Clara grew rounder and more emphatic in her opinions, and more impatient with things that did not deserve patience, which Caleb navigated with a combination of good humor and genuine care that kept them mostly on the right side of each other. There were hard days, because there are always hard days. A late summer storm took part of the roof off the chicken coop, and Caleb spent a wet and miserable afternoon fixing it, while Clara stood in the doorway of the barn and directed operations with the calm authority of someone who is going to do something about the situation, but currently cannot climb a ladder. A neighboring farmer's cattle got through a fence and damaged part of the garden, and the negotiation about compensation was unpleasant and drawn out in the way of disputes between neighbors who both feel wronged and neither wants to back down first. Wilhelm had a bad week in July when the trembling was bad and the tiredness was worse, and the doctor who came from town said nothing useful and charged too much for it. But summer also brought the small good things that a farm in the hill country produces in that season, the long warm evenings on the porch, the garden coming in abundantly enough to fill the larder, the sound of the creek at night through the open window, the way the light moved through the cottonwood leaves in the afternoons, making patterns on the ground that shifted with the breeze. Caleb worked the spring cattle drive for the neighboring ranch in late April and early May, which took him away for 3 weeks and was the longest he had been gone since the wedding. And when he came back, Clara was standing in the yard with her arms crossed, and her expression precisely calibrated to indicate that she was not going to make a fuss about how glad she was to see him, but that she was, in fact, very glad to see him. He got down from Duchess and crossed the yard to her, and she uncrossed her arms and let him fold her in, and she pressed her face briefly into his shoulder and was still for a moment, just still, in the middle of all her usual movement and purpose, and he held her and felt the shape of their son or daughter between them, and thought that the life he was living was more than he had ever had a clear picture of wanting. 3 weeks is too long, he said into her hair. Yes, she said, into his shoulder. It is. They stood there in the yard for another moment, and then Clara straightened and stepped back and said, "Your supper has been keeping warm for an hour," in the tone of someone resuming normal operations, and Caleb grinned and followed her inside. The baby came in September, as Clara had predicted, on a night that was cool and clear and smelled of cedar, and the first whisper of autumn. The birth was attended by the midwife from the nearest town, a capable woman named Mrs. Brandt, who had been attending births in the hill country for 20 years, and who managed the whole process with a matter-of-fact competence that Clara approved of entirely. Caleb was in the kitchen, because that was where men were put in these situations, and he found the several hours he spent there to be among the most challenging of his life, not because of any dramatic emergency, but simply because he was a person who preferred to be able to do something. And here there was nothing for him to do but wait, and the sounds from the other room did not help. But the sounds changed, eventually, and then there was a different sound, small and indignant and new, and then Mrs. Brandt opened the door and said, with the efficient warmth of a woman who has seen this particular miracle many times and has not become accustomed to it, "You have a son, Mr. Hurst. Come meet him." He was small and red and furious about everything, which seemed appropriate given his mother. He had dark hair, which was already damp and slightly chaotic on his head, and when Caleb held him for the first time, in the lamplight of the bedroom with Clara watching from the pillow with tired eyes and a composed expression that could not entirely hide its wonder, the boy grabbed Caleb's finger with the reflexive grip of the newborn and held on with a strength that was surprising and perfect. "He is strong," Caleb said. "Of course he is," Clara said. "What will we call him?" They had discussed this at length over the summer, as they discussed most things with both opinions and productive disagreement, and had arrived at an answer by the particular root of their conversations, which was to begin with separate ideas, argue about them honestly, and end somewhere neither of them had started. "Wilhelm," Caleb said, "for your father." Clara looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were very bright, which was the closest she came in that moment to what another woman might have expressed differently. "And then James," she said, "for your father." Caleb's father had died when Caleb was 11, and he had not talked about him often, but Clara had asked once, in the careful way she asked about things that mattered, and he had told her and she had remembered. She always remembered. "Wilhelm James Hurst," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said, "that is who he is." Wilhelm Voss, when he was brought in to see his grandson the next morning, sat in the chair beside the bed and held the baby with his big trembling hands, very still with the effort of being careful, and looked at the small face for a long time without saying anything. Then he said in German something that Clara later translated for Caleb as, "Well, Anna, now there is someone to carry it forward." Caleb thanked him, silently and privately, for being the kind of man whose approval meant something worth having. The winter of that year was quieter and fuller than the previous one. The baby took up an enormous amount of space in the farmhouse for something so physically small, filling every room with his requirements and his noises and his capacity to be an immediate priority at any hour of the day or night. Clara managed this with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, and Caleb found himself a willing and active participant in the domestic architecture of new parenthood, in a way that was not entirely common for men of his time and place, but which Clara clearly expected, and which he provided without considering it remarkable. On the evenings when Wilhelm was well enough to hold the baby, Caleb and Clara sat together on the porch in their coats in the cold winter air, and watched the hill country dark settle in, and talked the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about the farm and the future and the things they had read and the things they thought about, and about the small specific pleasures of the life they were living. "Are you happy?" Clara asked him on one of those evenings, without preamble, in the way she had of asking the question that was actually in the room. He looked at the dark hills and the stars above them, cold and clear and so numerous in the sky above the hill country that they gave the darkness texture. "Yes," he said, "genuinely and specifically happy. Are you?" "Yes," she said. though I intend to keep working on the farm's water situation because the dry well was only the beginning of a larger problem and I have some ideas." "Of course you do," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You are laughing at me." "I am delighted by you," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold and the dark, and then she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the winter settled over the hill country and the stars moved in their slow, reliable arc. In February, when little Wilhelm was 5 months old and had developed opinions about most things, Henry Voss came down from the railroad for the first time since the wedding. He was a few years older than Clara, with their father's build and his mother's coloring, and he arrived with a trunk of things he had brought as gifts, and an expression of a man who knows he has some reckoning to do and is prepared, if not eager, to do it. He spent 3 days at the farm. On the first day he was stiff with everyone in the way of a person managing guilt, and on the second day he sat on the porch with Caleb for 2 hours and talked in the direct way of men who are deciding whether to trust each other, and they arrived, by the end of it, at a mutual respect that was the beginning of something. On the third day he held his nephew for an hour by the fire and talked to him in both German and English about the world, which made Clara smile from across the room in the private way. She smiled at things that moved her. When he left, he shook Caleb's hand firmly and told his sister that she had done well, which was not the most elegant of sentiments but was honest, and Clara accepted it as such. Spring came again, as spring does, transforming the hill country from its gray and brown patience into the extravagant green that always arrived like a surprise and a vindication. The apple tree on the south side of the house bloomed again, even more densely than the previous year, and Clara stood under it with little Wilhelm on her hip and pointed up at the blossoms and told him, in a mixture of German and English, something about the tree and where it had come from and why it mattered. Caleb watched from the doorway of the barn and felt the kind of happiness that is not an event but a state, the happiness that is just the specific quality of your own life when it has come together in the way that it ought. Wilhelm Voss died in April, on a morning when the hills were at their greenest, and the creek was running full, and the air smelled of the flowers that bloom in the hill country after rain. He had been declining since winter with the quiet inevitability of a man whose body had used up its reserves, and the end when it came was peaceful, in his own bed in his own house, with Clara holding one of his hands and Caleb holding the other, and the windows open to the spring morning. Clara wept, quietly and privately, in the way that she did everything of great importance, and Caleb held her in the kitchen afterward while little Wilhelm slept in his crib in the next room, and he did not try to make it better because he understood that some things should not be rushed past, that grief when it is real deserves the time it takes. They buried Wilhelm Voss in the church cemetery in town, beside his wife Anna, with the pastor speaking in both languages and the German community coming out in the same numbers they had come out for the wedding, because this community understood that a life deserved to be witnessed at both ends. Henry came down from the railroad for the burial and stayed a week, which was more than anyone had expected and which meant something. The farm continued, because farms continue. That is one of the truths about farming, that it does not wait for grief to finish before requiring attention. Clara channeled her morning into work with the direct efficiency that was her nature, and the farm responded to that attention as it always had. That summer was a good one, all things considered. The garden was excellent, the apple tree produced abundantly, and the cattle work on the neighboring ranch went well enough that Caleb was offered a more permanent arrangement that would give them a steadier income through the year. Little Wilhelm learned to walk in June, colliding with everything in the farmhouse with cheerful determination, and by August was attempting to communicate in a multilingual fusion that was not entirely recognizable as any specific language, but was comprehensible to anyone paying close attention. In the evenings, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch, where Wilhelm Voss's chair now stood empty but not removed because Clara was not ready to remove it yet. And they watched the hill country move through its summer rhythms and talked and were quiet in turn. And the life they had built felt solid beneath them. Not perfect but genuinely good, built of true things. One evening in late July, Caleb was sitting on the porch step sharpening a knife while Clara nursed the baby inside, and he heard her begin to sing. She sang the same way she had always sung, unhurried and private and wholly itself, and the sound came through the open window and moved across the yard in the summer evening air, and reached him exactly as it had reached him through the cottonwood trees 2 years ago on a June afternoon, when he had ridden 12 miles in the heat on his way to somewhere else. He set down the knife and the whetstone and sat there in the evening light and listened, and did not move, and the feeling that went through him was the same feeling it had been the first time, a kind of arrested completeness, as though the world had momentarily organized itself into something that could not be improved upon. Clara came out a little while later with little Wilhelm drowsy on her shoulder and found Caleb sitting on the step with his hands quiet on his knees. "You are just sitting there," she said. "I am listening to you sing," he said. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "The same as the first time," she said, not a question. "The same as the first time," he agreed. She sat down beside him on the step, settling the sleepy baby between them, and looked out at the yard and the beginning of the dark at the edge of the trees. "You should know," she said, "that I will probably be singing for the rest of my life. You will likely be listening quite a lot." "I do not see the problem in that," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and little Wilhelm made a small sound of settled contentment between them, and the hill country evening did what hill country evenings do, coming down over the cedar and limestone in layers of color that no painter could quite capture, because it was the air itself that was the thing, the specific warm, alive quality of this particular place and time. The years that followed were built on that foundation, solid and human and honest. Caleb's arrangement with the neighboring ranch developed into a genuine partnership by 1881, when he and a rancher named Beck combined their resources and experience in a way that gave both operations more security and flexibility than either had alone. It required more of Caleb's time in the saddle, but kept him close enough to home that the long separations of the open range became a thing of the past. He was good at the work and Beck was fair, and the arrangement suited both of them. The Voss farm became the Hurst farm in the practical ways, though it kept the name Voss in the family's understanding of it, because the name carried the history of the place, and the place deserved its history. Clara ran the domestic and agricultural operation with the organized authority of a person who thinks in systems, and the farm responded, year by year, with greater productivity and stability. Little Wilhelm grew fast and strong and inherited from both parents the quality of paying close attention to things, which in him expressed itself as an interest in every living creature on the property, from the horses to the barn cats to the bees that had taken up residence in the old hollow oak at the edge of the garden. He was 3 years old when Clara told Caleb, on another early morning over another cup of coffee, that there was going to be a second child. "When?" He said, because it was the first thing he always asked. "Spring," she said. "The apple tree will be blooming," he said. She looked at him with that almost smile. "Everything is about that apple tree with you." "The apple tree is a very significant tree," he said. "It was one of the first things we worked on together." "You are a sentimental man, Caleb Hurst," she said, and poured them both more coffee. The second child arrived in late March 1882, in the first flush of the hill country spring, and was a girl with Clara's dark hair and Caleb's gray eyes, a combination that seemed to surprise both of those things into something new and entirely her own. They named her Anna for Clara's mother, and Clara held her in the lamplight with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded, just wonder and love, and the particular softness that this specific child had somehow produced in a face that did not often go soft. Wilhelm, aged 3, stood on his toes to look at his sister in Clara's arms, and announced that she was very small and that he had expected more from her. Clara told him, in her matter-of-fact way, that she had also been very small once, and that his assessment would need revising over time. And Wilhelm considered this information with the serious concentration of a small person encountering new data. Life with two children was louder and more complicated and fuller in ways that Caleb had not entirely anticipated. Little Anna was a different person from her brother almost from the beginning, quieter and more observant, inclined to watch things carefully before deciding what to do about them. And she attached herself to Caleb with a particular early loyalty that he was not prepared for, and that moved him beyond any eloquent description of it. She would reach for him when he came in from the day's work with a certainty that suggested she had been expecting him, and was satisfied to find that expectations were being met. And he would hold her, and she would put her small hand on his face with the same gesture that her mother used. And he would stand there in the kitchen doorway with the smell of horses and fresh air still on him, and hold his daughter, and think about the distance between where his life had started and where it had arrived. The spring of 1883 brought changes to the area that touched everyone in the hill country. The railroad had expanded its reach into new parts of Texas, and with it came more settlers and more development and a changing of the country that was irreversible, and that people felt differently about depending on who they were and what they had lost. For the German farming communities, it brought new markets and new opportunities. For others in the region, particularly the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had spent decades on the losing end of an ongoing and brutal dispossession of their lands, it brought the final closing of a door that had been slamming shut for years. Caleb had ridden through enough of the West to understand that the land he now called home had a history that did not begin with European settlement, that the limestone hills and the cedar breaks, and the creek with the cottonwood trees along its bank, had belonged to people long before Wilhelm Voss had arrived from Germany with his cuttings and his hope. He talked about this with Clara, who had grown up in the hill country and had her own complicated understanding of it, the knowledge of someone whose community had itself been the object of prejudice and difficulty, but who had also benefited from systems that took from others. There were no simple resolutions to these conversations, because there were no simple resolutions to the history itself. But Caleb believed that acknowledging a truth clearly was better than not acknowledging it, and Clara believed the same, and it was one of the things they agreed on without disagreement. The spring of 1883 was also when Henry Voss, Clara's brother, arrived at the farm with unexpected news. He was coming off the railroad. He had saved enough to buy land and wanted to do it near the only family he had left, and he was asking whether Caleb had thoughts on where to look. Caleb had several thoughts and shared them, and by summer Henry had purchased a small piece of land 3 miles east of the Hurst farm and was building a house on it with a focused determination that suggested he was making up for time lost. He was a good neighbor and a better brother than he had previously been, and Clara accepted this shift in him with the honest pragmatism that she applied to most things, giving credit for the change without pretending the absence had been nothing. By the fall of 1883, the farm was flourishing by any honest measure. The apple tree on the south side of the house had become a genuine producer, its fruit filling the larder every autumn and providing a surplus that Clara sold in town, where the German community appreciated quality preserves. The vegetable garden was large and well managed. The income from the cattle partnership with Beck was steady and fair. The two children were growing up loud and curious and bilingual, because Clara had continued to insist on German as a household language alongside English, and the sound of the house on any given day was a mixture of both that had its own particular music. Little Wilhelm was now 5, a serious-minded child who had decided that he would be a farmer and had begun expressing opinions about the management of the property that were occasionally more informed than expected. Little Anna was 1.5, walking everywhere with great purpose and very little predictability. On an October evening, Caleb sat on the porch step in the last of the year's warmth and watched the light leave the hill country sky in colors that were always different and always familiar. Clara came and sat beside him, and little Anna made her determined way across the porch to climb into his lap, and little Wilhelm sat on the top step and looked out at the yard with the expression of someone planning things. The farm was quiet around them, the chickens settled for the night, the horses still in the corral, the apple tree a dark shape against the sky. The creek murmured somewhere through the cottonwood trees, carrying its sound across the evening air. Caleb thought about the first time he had heard that creek, 2 years before he had sat down in the grass along its bank and heard a woman singing. He thought about the way the voice had come through the trees and taken him apart, efficiently and without warning, and how he had sat there in the tall grass and been incapable of moving because some part of him had understood before the rest of him had caught up that something important was happening. "Clara," he said. She was leaning against him, which was her way in the evenings now, easy and natural without fuss. She said. "Do you remember that I told you I heard you singing before you found me in the grass? You have mentioned it a number of times," she said. "I believe it constitutes your origin story." "I was going to Fredericksburg with a letter for a land agent," he said. "I was 12 miles into a 15-mile ride and the day was hot and I was thinking about nothing in particular. And then," she said, in the tone of someone who knows the answer but wants to hear it said, "and then I heard you," he said, "and I stopped and I sat down and I did not move." She turned her head to look up at him, close and familiar and still completely herself, those dark direct eyes finding his in the October evening light. "What was I singing?" she said. "Something about a river that never dried up," he said, "and home and leaving." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "I do not remember what I was singing," she said, "but I remember finding you in the grass, looking like you had been there for a long time." "I had only been there a few minutes," he said, "but yes." She looked at him for another moment, and then she settled her head back against his shoulder and looked out at the yard and the hills beyond it going dark in the October evening. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "I am glad you did not sing more quietly," he said. She made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh, the real one that came out when something caught her off guard, brief and genuine, and as good as the singing. Little Anna, in Caleb's lap, reached up and patted his face with her small hand, establishing that she was still present and expected to be factored in, and Caleb caught her hand and pressed it to his cheek and said, "Yes, sweetheart, I know, you are here." Little Wilhelm turned from the yard and said, "Father, I think the north fence will need attention before winter." Caleb looked over his son's head at Clara, who was looking at the sky with an expression of controlled amusement. "You are right," Caleb said to his son. "We will look at it tomorrow." "Good," Wilhelm said with satisfaction and went back to studying the yard. The years that followed were full in the way of genuinely lived lives. Not the surface fullness of busy days, but the deeper fullness of a life that has real things in it. More seasons on the farm, more arguments about the apple tree and the fence line and the proper way to manage the water situation, more evenings on the porch and more nights with the windows open to the sounds of the hill country, more conversations that went from practical to philosophical and back again, because that was how Clara's mind worked, and Caleb had long since become conversant in its movements. Clara did sing, and often. She sang when she was working, as she always had, without quite meaning to, without performing it, just letting it happen the way a person breathes, because the music was part of how she moved through the world. She sang in German and in English and sometimes in a mixture of both, hymns and folk songs and things that seemed to have no source except her own internal arrangements, melodies she had assembled from pieces of other things. Caleb listened. He always listened. Not with the same arrested stillness as that first afternoon in the grass, because that was the shock of first encounter, the sudden meeting of something you did not know you had been missing. What he felt now was different, a calm and continuous pleasure, a quiet gratitude that was the domestic form of what that first listening had been. The same thing lived daily rather than discovered all at once. By 1885, the farm had taken on a settled permanence that was a product of 7 years of consistent effort. The apple tree on the south side of the house was now a mature tree, generously productive, its branches extending over a wider shade in summer that made the south side of the house noticeably cooler. Clara had expanded the garden twice and had begun selling a regular portion of the produce in town, which had become a small but meaningful contribution to the household's resources. Henry Voss had built a good house on his land to the east and had surprised everyone, including himself, by marrying a woman from the town, a schoolteacher named Margaret who was well-read and practical, and whom Clara approved of with a directness that Margaret understood was the highest form of compliment available. Little Wilhelm was 7 now, tall for his age and serious-minded in the way of a child, who has decided that the world is a project requiring management. He had taken on real responsibilities on the farm, small but genuine ones, and he carried them with the same composed responsibility that characterized his mother's approach to everything. Little Anna was 3, and had developed a personality that was the meeting point between her parents' characters, her father's patience and her mother's precision, with a cheerfulness that seemed to be entirely her own. In the spring of 1885, Clara told Caleb over the breakfast table that she thought there might be a third child coming. He looked at her across the table with the familiar happiness that this news produced in him, that particular quality of the future opening up one more door. When? He said, "Autumn," she said. "October, I think." "The apple harvest," he said. She pointed at him with her spoon. "Do not make this about the apple tree again." "Everything happens in relation to the apple tree," he said. "I am simply acknowledging the calendar." The third child arrived on a bright October morning when the apple tree was heavy with fruit, and the hill country was doing its modest version of autumn color, the cedar staying green while the sumac along the creek went red and the grasses went gold. He was a boy, rounder and more immediately contented than his siblings had been as newborns, with Caleb's gray eyes and Clara's dark hair, and a disposition that suggested he had arrived having already made peace with most of his circumstances. They named him Carl, for no one in particular but for the sound of it and the way it sat between them, solid and clear. Wilhelm, aged 7, inspected his new brother with the critical eye of an experienced older sibling, and declared that this one seemed better organized than Anna had been. Anna, aged 3, was less certain about the entire arrangement and needed a period of adjustment that Clara managed with her usual patient competence. The family that Caleb had assembled from a ride through the hill country on a hot June day in 1878 was now 3 children and a farm and a partnership, and a brother-in-law 3 miles east, and a network of community that extended through the German settlements of the hill country and beyond. It was not what he would have described, at 26, if someone had asked him to describe his future, because at 26 he had not been in the habit of describing futures. He had been in the habit of moving forward through whatever the day presented. But sitting on the porch in the October evening of 1885, with baby Carl in his arms and Anna asleep against his leg and Wilhelm inside helping his mother, Caleb thought that if he had been asked to design a life from the beginning with full information and perfect judgment, he was not sure he would have arrived at anything better than this. Not more dramatic, not more eventful, not more externally remarkable, but more genuinely his, more genuinely theirs. The creek moved through the cottonwood trees in the dark beyond the yard, making its constant low sound. The hills above the farm were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. The apple tree on the south side of the house stood quiet and full in the October night. From inside the house, he heard Clara begin to sing. It was the same quality of voice it had always been, clear and low and unhurried, moving through whatever melody she had chosen with the easy confidence of something that simply belongs to itself. He could not make out all the words, but he could hear the shape of it, the even flow of it, the way it filled the house and came out through the windows into the night. He sat in the October air with his son in his arms and listened, and he did not move, and he did not want to move, and everything that had happened between that first afternoon in the grass and this evening on the porch felt like a single continuous thing, a line drawn from there to here that was the exact shape of his life, and that he would not have changed in any particular, even the hard particulars, because the hard particulars were part of what made it real. Clara came out eventually with her coat on, because the evening was cool, and looked at the baby in his arms and at the sleeping Anna against his leg and at her husband's face in the starlight. "You have that look again," she said. "What look?" he said. "The look you had in the grass," she said. "The one where you are not going anywhere." He looked up at her. This woman he had married in December 7 years ago. This woman who had been carrying water from the creek when he found her, who had argued with him about apple trees and fence posts and drainage and the proper management of everything, who had given him 3 children and the shape of a life he had not known how to imagine, and who sang in the early mornings and the evenings with the same private and confident voice that had stopped him cold on a hot June afternoon on his way to somewhere else. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She sat down beside him on the step, and he moved his arm so she could lean against him, and she did, and the baby between them stirred and settled and was still. They sat on the porch of their home in the Texas Hill Country on an October evening in 1885, under the stars that come up clear and thick in that country when the weather is right, and the creek moved through the cottonwood trees, and the apple tree stood on the south side of the house, and the hills went away in every direction into the dark, and there was nothing left unfinished, and nothing left unresolved, and nothing that needed to be anywhere other than exactly where it was. Caleb put his face briefly into Clara's hair, which smelled of bread and cedar and the specific warm, living smell of her, and she reached up without looking and put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, her fingers closing over his the way they had learned to close, familiar and certain. "Tell me something," she said, looking out at the stars. "Anything," he said. "Tell me what you were thinking about when you sat down in the grass," she said. "The first time. What was actually in your head?" He was quiet for a moment, remembering the heat and the horse and the letter in his saddlebag, and the sound coming through the trees that had dismantled his plans so completely and efficiently. "I was not thinking," he said. "That was the thing. I sat down in the grass and my mind went completely quiet. I have never in my life had my mind go completely quiet. And then I thought, whatever this is, I am not ready to stop hearing it." Clara was quiet beside him for a moment. "Good," she said. "Because I have not stopped yet." "I know," he said. "I can tell." She turned her head and looked at him, and in the starlight her face was the face he had been looking at for 7 years, the same face that had measured him from the tree line with that water bucket and decided he was worth finding out about, and he thought that he was the luckiest man in the Texas Hill Country, which was itself a considerable piece of the world. "I love you, Caleb Hurst," she said, direct and even the way she said everything that mattered. "I love you, Clara Hurst," he said. "I have loved you since I sat down in that grass and refused to get up." She shook her head slightly in the way she did when she was not going to bother being exasperated because there was no point. "One of these days," she said, "I am going to sing somewhere else entirely and see what happens." "You can try," he said, "but I will follow the sound." She almost said something, and then she did not, and instead she leaned against him and looked out at the stars with that quiet she had when something had been said well enough that adding to it would only make it less. The baby slept. The creek ran. The apple tree stood in the dark on the south side of the house, heavy with October fruit, rooted in the rocky limestone soil of the hill country, carrying every year's worth of attention and care and argument in its branches, producing more abundantly each season than the last. And the stars came on in the Texas sky the way they always had, in numbers that made the darkness between them a secondary thing, and the hill country settled into its night around a farmhouse where a family was alive and whole, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done. And the rest was this, just this: the October air and the sound of the creek and the singing that would start again in the morning, clear and low and entirely itself, moving through the house and out through the windows into the world.